This is the second day of the Turbulent Democracy and the International System conference. This is the third edition of the Turbulent Democracy and the International System conference. The first one we held 5 years ago, a few months after Brexit and a few months before Trump's election. So a lot of things have happened since then. So we have a lot to discuss here. Yesterday we had the first section. The first section dealt with the main drivers of change in international, at the global stage, namely technological change, climate change, surveillance, cyber war. And today the idea is to focus on great power politics, to analyze those drivers, but in the context of great power politics, especially the US and China, the European Union, but also from the perspective of emerging mid-sized countries like Brazil, economically speaking, politically speaking, right? How do we fit in this moving landscape? So without further ado, let me again thank you, GMF, for the partnership, and turn the mic to Ian Lesser.
Sergio, thank you very, very much. And on behalf of GMF, let me also say a welcome to this second day, and to thank you, Sergio, and the Foundation for the partnership as well. And to thank all of you for joining today. We had a terrific conversation yesterday. It was very, very lively. It wound up being a lot, as you said, well, about what's happening in the international scene, but also sort of domestic politics and what's happening in our societies on all three sides of this triangle, including what's happening as a result of the COVID experience. And one of the conclusions that came out of that actually was that COVID has changed a lot and meant a lot in terms of societies and politics, and maybe changed the political fate of a number of actors with a lot of meaning. But in terms of international affairs, in terms of some of the big picture things like the rise of great power competition, the return of great power politics, it probably isn't that significant, that these were trends that were in place anyway, will continue, will evolve, and COVID maybe hasn't made a great difference to those things, but we could talk about that. So it's a great group we have with us today to talk about these things. And let me just very briefly tell you who we have with us. We have, first of all, Thomas Shannon, who we describe rather, I would say cryptically, as an American diplomat, but a very, very senior one, occupied a lot of very, very senior posts in the American State Department, but among other things has been ambassador to Brazil and has been with us in this conversation before. Tom, thank you very much for joining us today. Ivan Krastev, who's coming to us today from, I think, the Bulgarian countryside, but is normally in Vienna, and is also the chairman, among other things, of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, and a longtime friend of GMF, and great to have you with us, Ivan. Thank you very much. And not least also Ambassador Sergio Amaral, who is also somewhat cryptically described as a Brazilian diplomat, but again, a very senior one, who has been, among other things, a Brazilian ambassador in Washington. So Sergio, thank you as well. I've asked the three of them, maybe just in the order that we have here, Tom, Ivan, Sergio, to share with us, maybe for 10 minutes each, your take on where this broadly speaking, global geopolitics may be headed, but with specific reference to this question of great power competition and what you would expect from the relationship between the United States and China and Europe. Also, if we get into it now, fine, or later, fine, what it will mean for others, not least Brazil. So, Tom, maybe I could start with you, and we look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a real pleasure to be here and be with such a distinguished group of panelists. And obviously, having participated previously in these events, I'm much attached to them. especially when the turbulent democracies continue to be the United States and Brazil more than anything else. Maybe put India in there just for a good mix. But as we engage today in this conversation, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, I think it's going to be a lively one. I would just make a couple points at the very beginning. First, great power competition as a concept has been embraced broadly by the great powers, China and the United States. And if you look at the interim strategic guidance released by the administration, it shows clearly that the United States understands itself as being in a competition with China, and that the competition is not just political or ideological, although they do define it in terms of democracies versus authoritarianism. But it's also really about practical issues of governance. In other words, which governmental systems can deliver the goods most efficiently and most effectively, and that this is going to be the selling point for both China and the United States as these two great powers circle each other around the globe. But also both have understood that they need to find a space in which they can operate together. And so I think you can say that while great power competition has been embraced, it's actually a pretty easy thing to embrace as a concept. I think what's more challenging, both intellectually or conceptually, but also in terms of practice, is great power collaboration or great power cooperation. And I think in many ways, the tone and direction of the rest of this century is going to be defined by the kinds of mechanisms the United States and China are able to work out among themselves to permit this kind of cooperation or collaboration. And I think this kind of cooperation or collaboration is going to be demanded by the rest of the global community, because I don't think anybody out there, the European Union included, is prepared to be the ham in this sandwich. Nobody wants to get between these two great powers. And the European Union is already developing ideas of strategic autonomy in which they see themselves as not part of this competition and not wanting to be harmed by it. And countries such as Brazil, while they will face enormous pressure from both sides to declare themselves, I think need to begin to ensure that they can maintain enough distance between the two that they can, if not act as arbiters or referees, at least continue to remind the great powers that the world is big. But as we look at this, it's important to understand something. Ian, you noted at the beginning that in the previous discussion, there was some doubt as to whether or not COVID has changed the underlying drivers of change in political power in the world. I would say it has, and I would say it has in a couple of ways. First, and maybe most importantly, both the United States and China come out of COVID looking really bad. China, because of its deceptive ways in the immediate beginning of the outbreak, its unwillingness to share information, its continuing unwillingness to address the origins of COVID, but also the degree to which the Communist Party has shown that it is incapable of the kind of transparency and openness that's needed for cooperation on something as dramatic as a global pandemic. The United States, for the terrible handling of COVID at the beginning, for the incredible economic loss and human loss that it has imposed on the United States, and in the immediate aftermath of the beginning of the vaccination process, a real unwillingness to participate in a global vaccination effort. And although that is changing under the Biden administration, it's still way too slow. And so effectively, the United States has been participating in an effort to protect itself in a vaccination program that has limited vaccines to a fairly small group of countries. And until China and the United States find a way to get beyond these early missteps and work together on COVID, I think there's going to be a COVID hangover, which is going to have a significant impact on how countries view cooperation with the United States, how they view cooperation with China. And it's certainly going to have an impact internally in societies around the world as they attempt to judge the value and the reliability of relationships with the United States and China. And this creates a diplomatic opening for those who want to find a way to ensure that the world doesn't get trapped in a vice with China on one side and the United States on another, and to continually remind people that there is a larger world that needs to be taken care of, and that the issues facing this world are larger than the issues that are of importance to the United States and China. So I think that in many ways, the challenges we face here is how to ensure that the United States and China continue to keep open the possibility of cooperation and collaboration, that they understand that the problem set facing the globe today is much larger than the problem sets both countries face, either domestically or in their bilateral relationship. But that secondly, both countries need to be reminded that this pandemic is not going away, that it's going to be with us for a long time. And until both the United States and China find a way to be honest with each other, honest with themselves, and honest with the world about how to address COVID, it's going to be very hard for either one of them to make an argument that they should be followed.
Tom, thank you very much. And thanks for picking up on that question about the consequences of COVID. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think probably we'd all agree with your assessment that you gave us about that in different ways, the US and China don't come off looking well out of this. On the other hand, viewed from an economic point of view, maybe for structural reasons, the two countries have done better than almost anybody else coming out of this, and that maybe raises some questions for us too, which we can come back to. But let's hold those for a moment. And I apologize for the dog in the background. I'm tempted to make that comment about the dog that didn't bark in terms of U.S.-China competition, but I won't. But I will turn to you, Yvonne, and look forward to your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'll basically start also from this COVID story, because one is how much COVID changed the world, but the other is to what extent COVID allows us to see how the world has been changed before. And we have been kind of blind to the changes. And this is one of the things, because most people are going to agree that it is not so much a crisis that was a disruption, but much more accelerator of the trends that have been there before. But if the experts have been arguing these trends, suddenly everybody realizes that. For example, there was a talk about geopolitical polarization. There was a talk about fragmentation, but it was an expert talk, and now it becomes basically part of the everyday conversations. And I'm saying this because there were two things that COVID did, which in my view quite important in order to make the argument that I'll try to make. The first is that if there was a real dictatorship, particularly in the first 5 or 6 months of COVID, it was the dictatorship of comparisons. Suddenly, we're living in the world that was sharing the same type of a problem, and people started to compare on an everyday basis how many people are infected in Brazil, how many people are dying in Bulgaria, how many people are vaccinated in Israel. So this kind of illusion that you can easily compare, and in a certain way, keeping the governments under control through comparison, was something which was very big. And this is why also the governments were copycat policies was so popular in the beginning, where there was high level of uncertainty. And the second is because of COVID more than ever before, people on the street start to think through projections. It's not what is happening today, but what we expect basically if this is the trend to happen in 6 months or 8 months or 10 months. And I do believe this is a major change when it comes also to the way people understand what is going on. I'm going to share with you some data that I have from a study which is still not published by the European Council on Foreign Relations, but the data was so shocking, so please keep it for yourself, because otherwise I'm going to hurt the colleagues. But the data is the following. We have been asking people in the 12 of the key EU member states, do you believe that your country is in a kind of a new Cold War, or is going to end up in a new Cold War with Russia or China? The second was, do you believe that the United States is in Cold War or going to end up in a Cold War with Russia and China? And the third was, do you believe that European Union is in a Cold War or going to end up? And here's the story. The majority of Europeans believe that the United States is in a Cold War with both Russia and China, or is going to end up there. There is no, in any single country, more than 20% that believe that their own country is in a Cold War with anybody, and of course, China much lower than Russia. But interestingly enough, the only hawk in Europe turned out to be the European Union. In every single country, there are more people who believe that European Union is in a Cold War with Russia and China than their own country. And I'm saying this because this came strange. Listen, normally you believe that the biggest problem of the European Union is that any policy that you're going to compromise is going to be perceived as soft by some and kind of a hawkish by others. For example, the perception of Russia and Poland in Italy differs significantly. Suddenly, this is not there anymore because Brussels basically is perceived as the United States ally. Suddenly today, the alliance is not between the United States and Europe, but between Washington and Brussels. And I'm saying this because this for us was a very strange when you look at the data. And the second thing that I do believe is critically important is that while we talk about geopolitical polarization and kind of competition between the United States and China, which is going to have a different dimension, technology, ideology, and others, my argument, and this is the only kind of argument I want to put here, is that I do believe that the next decade is going to be defined much more by the activism of the middle powers. Countries like Brazil, but Turkey, but Russia, but Israel. I mean, the definition of the middle power is going differently, and by the way, very much depends on region. But suddenly, these countries are too big just to wait to see what is going to happen. And on the other side, what also was said by Thomas before, they're trying to increase their room for maneuvering. They're not easier and comfortable to ally any of them easily with China or the United States. So you're ending up of a world populated by a Tito-minded middle powers. Some of them feel much closer. The European Union feels much closer to the United States than to China or Russia. This is very clear. There is no much sympathy to China or Russia in the European publics. But the fact that in this level of uncertainty, you are trying basically to increase your room for maneuvering. And this is the understanding of sovereignty. I do believe this is new. And this is going to be kind of a stronger, and this is also going to impact the way this kind of a conflict is going to be framed. So from this point of view, for example, the idea of the troubled democracies means that President Biden's frame of summit of democracy versus authoritarianism, Europeans are not particularly excited about this for several reasons. Either you should put in the summit of democracies some democracies which otherwise we criticize all day, telling that they're not really democracies. Or you're going to exclude certain countries which you believe that from the realpolitik could be quite important in dealing with Russia and China, but we are not going to define it as democracies. So from this point of view, it's interesting that while geopolitical polarization is there, I don't believe that the classical Cold War frame of democracy versus authoritarianism is going to be as effective as it was before. And part of it is that if you go and see most of Freedom House or any type of institutions that are trying to measure democracies in the world, the biggest problem is that this is the gray zone between democracy and authoritarianism. This is kind of authoritarian regimes that basically had a popularly elected leaders, or you have a democracies which very much turn illiberal than the classical autocratic regimes that are at the heart of all this. So from this point of view, this is quite interesting, and I'm going to end up on this. The middle powers are going to have a different strategies of how to maneuver. I can see for countries like Germany, but European Union as a whole, try to make ad hoc coalitions around certain issues and so on, try to basically have a small pact of each others. You can also be a much effective disruptive middle powers, what, for example, Turkey did during the Azeri-Armenian conflict, in order basically to make a claims about your importance, about your relevance in the world. But all of these middle powers, and I'm sure that Brazil is going to be one of them, cannot simply stay quiet. So strangely enough, the major impact of this combination of fragmentation and geopolitical polarization is going to be, in my view, the middle powers activism. Thank you.
Ivan, thank you very much. I mean, you've taken us into all kinds of extremely interesting directions, and some that also connect very well to the discussion that we had yesterday. There was quite a lengthy discussion about the Summit of Democracies idea, and it was underscored that one of the interesting facets, and it's not just about vocabulary, is that it's likely to be a summit on democracy, not of democracies, which is a kind of an important difference in a way, but doesn't necessarily make it easier to do. You made a very important point, I think, also about the U.S. relationship with the European Union, or the European Union itself. Perhaps the ECFR study that you quoted is telling us in some strange way that yes, Europe is finally succeeding in having a global strategy, and this is how it's perceived. But we can come back to that. And you asked a very important question of how regional actors, middle powers, will fare in all of this and how they will act. And I guess that's a wonderful transition for us to go to you, Sergio, to hear your thoughts and maybe to say a little, if you could, about the global scene, but also how it looks from Brazil, and how Brazil is likely to behave under these conditions. So Sergio, please, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased and happy and honored to participate in this discussion, because it raises two very important issues. But I'd like, first of all, to thank the Institute Fernando Henrique Cardoso and the German Marshall Fund for this timely event. And I think that our discussion is really on the key issues of the moment. I fundamentally agree with Tom Shannon in his perception of the competition, collaboration relationship between the United States and China, and also with respect to some comments on Brazil. I was surprised and happy to some extent by the comments of Ivan Kassa, who sees the role by middle countries as crucial, while taking into account the difficult period we are in. I can't see that very clearly, but I hope you are right and not me. I think that two issues I mentioned are, one, the dynamics of great power relations. And it's interesting that as it's put in the panel, this great power relationship is US, China, Europe, and Russia. And I think that there is a distinction among them, US and China playing a central role. As Kissinger says, the new world order is being paved, is being framed by the relationship between United States and China, be it in the direction of cooperation or confrontation, with the qualification that confrontation would bring the world to a tragedy, an unprecedented tragedy. So there's no alternative for cooperation, but this cooperation is very difficult, because the two superpowers go in different directions or have different goals. I think that the goal for China is basically the recognition of its emergency, and its proposal, as Xi Jinping made to Obama when he visited the United States in 2016, to have a special relation, a special dialogue with the United States on issues of great power interests. In other words, Xi Jinping was looking for a special relationship, for a construction of a duopoly, construction of a relationship with the United States and China, which would be superior to the relations with the other superpowers, which would become the real thrust or the real basis for a new condominium. While the China seems to know quite well what it wants. The United States did not answer to what I think was a sign of a proposal by Xi Jinping, the great power relationship with the United States. And why? I asked this question to Dan Coates, the former director of intelligence of the United States, during the Aspen Summit some years ago. And he said, I think the United States is not prepared to give an answer to this suggestion or to this idea. Society is not prepared to that at this point in time. I think that the goals of Europe and Russia are different. Basically, what I see Europe as wishing is preserving its interests with China and at the same time its alliance with the United States. And Russia is different. As many people say, like Tronai, that Russia wants to re-emerge, keep being relevant, but it doesn't have the conditions to play a central role in this new order. Another important difference, I think, is that in this great power dynamic, China will not give up. After many years of being the center of the world and a century of disillusion, China sticks to its emergence and it will not give it up. And at the same time, the United States, at least Biden, cannot change their position of containing China because its domestic opinion would not allow it. If China will not give up, the US cannot give up this strategic competition. Now, what's was the most important thing now is that there is a difference in the US of Trump and the US of Biden. Because while Trump resort, as we all know, to sanctions, Biden is looking for alliances as its strategic alliances. And I think that the transatlantic relationship will be the core of Biden's foreign policy, as it has been shown during the recent G7 meeting. But what is important in Biden also is that he accepts that in addition to competition or strategic competition, there are areas of cooperation. And this puts Biden together with many European leaders like Macron, who thinks that Europe has to preserve its autonomy and to work in a multilateral basis on different subjects with the United States and with China. This scenario of confrontation or strategic competition raises concerns for Brazil, as Tom Shannon anticipated very clearly. Brazil doesn't want to live in a dilemma in which it will have to choose between either one or the other, because both countries are very important for Brazil, even if this importance may be for different reasons. In the case of China, we have a very clear economic complementation. We complement each other, and that's why trade and investment have grown so quickly. In the case of the United States, it's different because we have a history that we share, we have values that we share, and we have been working together in many more different issues than just the issues of which oppose the two superpowers. And this perception is not only with respect to our own decisions, which have to be taken from the point of view of the Brazilian national interest. This has also to guide us in our foreign policy, in which we should be looking for areas of autonomy through alliances with other regions that are looking for the same thing, to preserve their capacity of autonomy, like Europe and like Latin America. And this puts as a big priority for us the agreement with the European Union and Mercosur. It's not only an economic agreement, it's an political efforts to reinforce and strengthen our look for autonomy. And it puts also as a priority, or should put as a priority to our foreign policy, the relationship with the Asia, the Pacific, AP, Alliance for the Pacific, and Mercosur, because they would represent 80% of Brazilian territory, 80% of Brazilian population, and 80% of Brazilian GDP. So these two are strategic movements for Brazil. It should be in our foreign policy. I would allow just one final comment, which is the idea of resurgence of a liberal democracy, which is implied in our panel. And I have some problems with this word, resurgence, because I don't think that the previous world order will come back. What I think is that the problems which are at stake for democracy are no longer formal issues of elections and political parties. More than before, what people, and I think this was mentioned also, but modern society is looking for the quality of governance. Because we have seen in many cases, countries that comply with the formal requirements of elections and participation of political parties, but we really couldn't say they are democracy. And quality of governance, more and more, will mean the resilience of the institutions, human rights, inequality, and environment. The threat in Latin America is no longer military coup, but the progressive erosion of the institution, as in many other countries in the world. The state of democracy is an ongoing dispute. We are in a big transition in both areas. The balance of power, in which what is at stake at the end of the day are the issues of hegemony succession. What's going on is a long tradition, like the one we had in the Peloponnesian Wars between the Athens and Sparta, as we had during the Age of Revolution by Hobsbawm between the French and the rest of the world. It's a much more profound change, transformation, which is going on. And it's difficult to see what will come because this is an ongoing dispute. The relationship between superpowers or the new format of the balance of power is in the offing. And the new form or concept of democracy is also in the offing. And this kind of struggle, this kind of transition, this kind of ongoing dispute will take time. Thank you.
Sergio, thank you very much indeed. And thanks to the three of you for starting us off in such a terrific way. I mean, there's so many issues there and we'll get to talk about lots of them, in fact, with all of you. So please do weigh in. You can raise your hand electronically. There's a way to do that. If you go to participants, there's a little button that says raise hand, or you can try to get my attention on the screen. But let me, while you're doing that, let me maybe come back to the three of you with a thought or two, a question or two. You all spoke about China and the US-China relationship, and there is a tendency to think about this in terms of a sort of gently deepening and troubling trend in terms of confrontation, if you want to talk about it as a Cold War, you want to use other vocabulary. But there is also embedded there a question of risk and near to medium-term stability. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. Not to be flip about this, there's a novel that came out recently called 2034, written by a former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, James Stavridis, that basically talks about what will go wrong by 2034, so that it's not just a question of great power competition, but frankly, a war. Even goes so far as to talk about a nuclear exchange. Now, we don't need to take it in that direction, but I think we'll agree that if you look at what's happening in the South China Sea or over Hong Kong or Taiwan or other issues, there is not only this building competition in a big sense, but there's also the risk of something going wrong next week. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that and what the consequences of that might be for the US, for Europe, for Brazil. Tom, maybe to start with you.
Well, thank you. Talking about war between the United States and China is a frightening prospect. And primarily because I believe that in the 21st century, we are on the cusp of any number of developments, socially, economically, but especially in terms of technology, in terms of artificial intelligence, life sciences, material science, and the rest, that if these can be played out, if these advances can be consolidated and developed and then dispersed through our societies, can fundamentally change the quality of life for the vast majority of people on our planet. But in order for this to happen, we have to keep the peace. And the prodigious, innovative research and development and industrial capabilities of the United States and China and our many partners around the world have to be enhanced. And so I believe there is an imperative for peace that is overwhelming and profound. Having said that, there are any number of triggers that could set off confrontation between the United States and China. Some of them in the South China Sea, some related to Hong Kong, some related to China's behavior in Tibet and in Xinjiang province, and most especially and worrisome, Taiwan. And I think that both China and the United States face a really significant diplomatic challenge in trying to ensure that as they address nationalism in both countries and as governments attempt to build the capability to engage and understand each other's problems, that they do so in ways that are going to promote peaceful resolution of disputes and not lead us into conflict. And it requires a degree of statesmanship that will be challenging, I think, for both the United States and China. But this is where I think the rest of the world needs to have a very significant voice. And it echoes what I said earlier, which is that the primary partners of both countries, but the European Union in particular, I think has to be very clear about expectations and insistent that violent conflict will not be accepted.
Thanks. Yvonne, maybe I can go to you, and also maybe even to extend that question to, the relationship with Russia, which, is increasingly troubled, but in some sense largely viewed as strategically stable. It looks like anything but stable if you're sitting in the Baltic or around the Black Sea. How do you read it?
Listen, this is an important question, because when I said that kind of the next 10 years is going to be defined by the middle powers activism, it was not a kind of a beneficent view of the world. The middle powers activism can destabilize the world to a great extent, because when you're fighting for relevance, you from time to time are ready to do very stupid things. And from this point of view, on one level, you're going to have this structural kind of a confrontation between the United States and China, which I do believe very much is going to be seen mostly in the technological sphere, where the decoupling is very much clear, and where basically both sides starts to see the technological interdependence and economic interdependence as a source of insecurity, not as a source of security. But for countries like Russia, for countries like Turkey, for many others, trying to do certain things on their own borders can engage and distract the great powers to the extent that something really bad can happen. For example, you can see a much higher level of coordination between the Russians and the Chinese when it comes basically testing the United States at the same time in Taiwan and Ukraine, for example. And this is different. And to be honest, talking to the Russians quite a lot, they're not seeing themselves as a classical ally of China. And this is quite interesting about the Russian doctrine of sovereignty. Russia is ready to join China, particularly because they do believe that they are under strong pressure from the West. But at the same time, when it comes to Asia, they try to be seen very much as an independent player. Russia is not going to support China over the conflict with India. They're going not to support about anything which is connected to Japan or South Korea. So you have this kind of alliances limited. This was not like this during the Cold War. You have a kind of a selective and strategic alliances, but because of it, and because of the fact that, for example, Chinese now cannot allow Russia to fail, because this is going to basically impact the very view of their own power. Both Russians and the Chinese, when they talk about the Iranian deal, okay, both of them favor non-nuclear Iran, but at the same time, both of them are very clear to try to show that sanctions do not work. And I do believe this type of a dilemmas can create a huge risks of misstepping, not a kind of a war because somebody decided strategically to engage in a very provocative action, but exactly because the middle powers can be a much more high risk players, some of them, than both China or the United States. And this is what I see kind of a much more troubled world when everybody's fighting for recognition. And just one sentence on Europe. In its relationship with the United States, Europe is in an interesting position because during the Cold War, Europe was on the major theater of confrontation with the Soviet Union. So now European Union sees itself slightly like the way Japan was seeing it during the Cold War. You are an important ally, but you are not where the major theater of confrontation is taking place. And I do believe this explains the fact that for Berlin, for Paris, it makes a lot of sense to see Brussels as the major strategic partner for the United States, and try to keep a much more room for maneuvering for themselves.
Vaughn, thanks very much. Sergio, I mean, how do you see it? Are you worried about things simply going wrong, quite apart from the big picture trends we've been talking about?
Yes, I think that there are risks, and mainly there are risks for accidents in many hot spots. But what I think, and again, I agree with Tom Shannon, is that there's no alternative for peace. The years ahead will be years in which the superpowers will probably alternate areas of cooperation with areas of confrontation or with competition. But between the two, there are some limits, because we cannot forget that nuclear deterrence was not abolished. It continues to exist. So there will be a limit for competition and for confrontation, which is the risk of major wars or the risks that would violate nuclear deterrence. So what is interesting in what is going on, it is how could China and the United States, if we single out these two superpowers, understand each other? I don't think that the new order will come from diplomatic conferences, that the diplomats will sit down like in the Congress of Vienna and decide what will be the new period of history. These negotiations are already taking place, and they are taking place in the facts, in the different small or localized conflicts in the islands of the South for China, or in the areas of conflict with Russia. They are taking place now. And perhaps the result or the end of this game, or the configuration of a new balance of power, will come from this daily conflicts, localized conflicts. And they will set perhaps a modus vivendi between the two superpowers.
Thanks very much. Again, I invite you all to weigh in, raise your hands, and join the debate. Let me just, while you're doing that, ask one more question to you all. That is, there was a sort of popular idea that we were in an era of transactional diplomacy. And this was encouraged to some extent by the Trump experience, but not just by that. Is that true, or frankly, we seeing something that is much more driven by ideology? However described, whether it's this sort of world competition between democracy and authoritarianism, as some have put it, or other cleavages. There's a lot of ideological content out there. Culture wars. You could talk about a lot of different things along these lines. Is it about pragmatism, or is it about values? I mean, Sergio, let me just go maybe in the reverse, or any of the three of you would like to pick up on this, but Sergio, maybe I go back to you on this one.
I don't think that ideology is now as important as it has been in the Cold War. I think there is a dispute of power. There is a change in the balance of power. And this is, I think, the core of the period we are going on and that we'll face in the next years. There's a political dispute, but there's also an economic dispute. There's also a convergence in other areas. I would say that transactional diplomacy may still have a role to play.
Okay. Tom, Yvonne, what do you think?
Yeah. Okay, let's start. Listen, I do believe that there is an ideology, but in a slightly different level, because before ideology was the state ideologies, which are in a certain way clashing with each other. Why now you see quite of ideological clash within the states. And from this point of view, you have identity politics, you have the cultural wars in different parts of the world, particularly in the democratic world, in different forms. And then comes the story that is the external threat these days enough to consolidate a society? This is a kind of a new story. And from this point of view, for the regimes like the Russian or the Chinese one, in a certain way, at least for the Russian case, which I know better, external threat was one of the ways for President Putin to consolidate his regime. The idea that Russia is under threat, that basically it's about keeping the territorial integrity, that the West basically is trying to destroy Russia. And because there was this traumatic experience of the 1990s, at least for the moment, he managed to consolidate power on political level, but not necessarily on the economic level. But what we're seeing today within the democracies is making it very difficult, because what it means transactional politics and policies, where, for example, Europeans started to believe that the change of government in the United States is a regime change. And I do believe on the other side, I do believe that Americans has many reasons to believe that many changes in Europe are going to have the same effect. And there is one also factor that I do believe plays quite important, particularly in the West, and it's going to play also in China, South Korea, Japan, and this is the demographic factor. You have an aging societies. And by the way, you have an aging societies in a period of major kind of demographic changes, much more migration. So the majority that have been created by the nation states and which were taken for permanent started now very much to be reshaped by the democratic majorities that come as the result of the elections. So I do believe structural ideological divides within particularly democracies are going to be critically much more important for the foreign policy than simply the frame of democracies versus authoritarianism that was so important for the Cold War. For example, I was shocked when the COVID-19 started, everybody was asking who is going to do better, democracies or autocracies. And then you go to the data and you see that the nature of the political regime does not explain who is going to respond better. There are democracies that did very well. There are authoritarian regimes that did very badly. On the other side, of course, China did quite well without being democracy. So from this point of view, I do believe it's going to be much more complicated, but it does not mean that ideology is dead and it's not going to play a role.
Tom, a thought on this one before, and now I see there are a number of people who want to come in, so we'll go right to you.
Just very briefly, I would underscore what Yvonne just said by saying that when the Cold War ended, the ideological power that was still standing was the United States. And the United States, however, does not understand itself ideologically, but it is. It is an ideological power. We like to pride ourselves on our pragmatism and our ability to operate across a variety of political environments and make decisions that reflect realities on the ground. But we also have within us a tanglement of our interests and values that we've never been able to untangle. And so as we move around the world, we carry an ideological point of view built around our own political history and understanding of the individual and the individual's relationship to the state that play a very important role in how the United States engages globally. And I think this is one of the reasons why President Trump's transactional approach was such a tremendous shock, because suddenly the ideological aspect of the American approach to the world fell away for a brief moment. The question is whether or not it comes back again, and what if it comes back with any broad support from the American people.
Thanks very much. Okay, Sergio Fausto, let me go to you. And I see a number of others who want to come in. And by the way, please don't worry about disguising comments in the form of a question. Comments are fine in their own right. And maybe we'll take a couple and then go back to our speakers. Sergio, please.
All right, I don't have comments. I have two questions, one for Tom and Sergio, and the other one for Yvonne. The first one is within the conceptual framework set by Yvonne around the idea of mid-power activism. My question is for Tom and Sergio about Brazil and South America. How critical is for Brazil to regain its regional leadership in South America to project its mid-power into the global stage, or can we go on our own based on the fact that we might think that we have enough assets to be an important player at the global stage? I think the easy answer to that question is, well, look at the positive sum games that we might play in the region. All right. But it's more complex than that, because there are conflicts of interest. There are some priorities that we have to choose. For instance, it's clear that Mercosur is not working, right? And I think we have a fundamental problem in this area. For Yvonne, I would like, in spite of the fact that some of you were downplaying the ideological component of great power politics, and I think you may be right. I would like to understand what is exactly let's put it that way, the functional role that this ideological component plays in the Chinese strategy, right? Because it is, we cannot simply dismiss this as a sort of veneer to realpolitik. There is more to it, and I would like to understand what is more to it than the eyes can meet. And this is my last question, and it is for Yvonne. That's it. Ian, back to you.
Oh, Sergio, thank you very much. And let me go, so we'll hold those, and let's go, if I could, to Thomas Kleiner-Brockhoff, my colleague in Berlin. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Very interesting conversation that in some ways sits uneasily with me when I listen to some of the emerging narrative. And I want to say why. The narrative here was that what we're seeing is the reemergence of great power competition leading to hegemonic succession. And for all those in the middle, they want to and should retain as much autonomy as they can, so that the elephants don't step on them. and that you want to stay out of that picture. Now, if mid-level countries, my own country, Germany, what if that hegemonic conflict, the great power conflict did not exist? Would we have issues with China? Would it then be hunky-dory? Of course it wouldn't. Therefore, because we have some, not all, of the same issues with China that the United States has. Therefore, the whole concept of sort of staying out of this, or as is a very complicated one. Therefore, I like the concept of a systemic competition much more. Now, and certainly the Europeans they have a dog in this fight. They are part of this. Now, will they be out front? Will they share all of the preferences, especially the military piece of the United States? No, certainly they won't. But it does make a difference how you frame this, whether you frame this as somewhere in the middle, or whether you have you're part of this, but are probably not the most prominent actors and try to retain some room for maneuver within that concept, which is why, by the way, the whole concept of European autonomy does not satisfy me at all, because it can easily be a path to a strategic no man's land, that you're ending in some dead end road rather than what those who conceptualize this would like to present it as. So my question is one that, coming from this type of thinking, sounds a little different to something that Tom Shannon said. I liked his idea of great power collaboration, because if you think about it as a systemic competition, you're also going to have a whole host of issues that are not just covered by systemic competition, but need to be solved nevertheless, starting with climate change, and we can tick down the list from Iran to what have you. But this would be the first time you have a systemic competition under the conditions of interdependence. So how would you see that collaboration working out? Because there is really no precedent to this type of constellation. And what does it require in order to control the systemic competition and give space to collaboration nonetheless?
Thomas, thanks very much. Maybe I come back from those to our group for some quick thoughts on those. Whatever you would like to pick up on, the number related to Brazil that Sergio put on the table, including this very specific question more broadly of the role of ideology in China's worldview and actions. And then Thomas's question about, well, in essence, you're asking about, do we need a new concert of powers? I mean, I'm doing violence to your very.
Yes,
he's going to tell me about this later. But anyway, what room for the middle in these various models? Okay, so Thomas, maybe Tom, we could come to you first. Far away.
Well, thank you, and a great set of questions and comments. In response to Sergio's question, and I look forward to listening to Sergio Amaral's response also, but Brazil is a lot like the United States in the sense that North America is United States' geographic address, but our aspirational address is global. And Brazil's geographic address is South America, but its aspirational address is global. And the two aren't necessarily related. I think Brazil can play a global role independent of what's happening along its borders and frontiers, or what's happening inside of Mercosur, should it choose to do so. I think Brazil had been building a global presence and a global relevance that has come to a screeching halt during the Bolsonaro government for all the reasons people are familiar with. And Brazil has, I believe, wasted a lot of diplomatic capital, or at least put that diplomatic capital in a safe place and is not using it at this point in time. And that its declining global presence has actually complicated its ability to solve problems in South America. So I don't see South America as being a stepping stone to something global. I see the relationship between the South American relations of Brazil and its global relations as being much more interactive and dynamic. And they can both affect each other. I was quite taken by Thomas's comments. I think they're profound in a way because they do kind of push us all to think about how the world cooperates in order to ensure that great powers find a way to collaborate, and that this isn't just about sitting out and waiting to see who wins the hegemonic succession or who preserves their hegemonic status or who replaces the other. It's about shaping a new world and ensuring that the power politics that are going to define much of it do so in ways that cause more benefit than harm. And I think that values are going to play an important part of this discussion. Whether we choose to call those values ideology, I don't know. But I do think in this regard that the United States has a significant advantage because of the relationships that it already has around the globe and a broad commitment on the parts of large hunks of the world to understanding of the individual, understanding of the state, promotion of human rights, acceptance of understanding of human rights, and a commitment to an open society that the Chinese just cannot bring to the table. The Chinese are going to bring something that's more transactional in this regard. But this is where I think the creativity of diplomacy and the creativity of our societies and how we relate to each other becomes so very important. But also, I think this is where how we engage with China is going to be important. And I think what Sergio Amaral said was very important, that in many ways, the grand strategies are going to be shaped bit by bit, one encounter at a time, one agreement at a time, instead of being fashioned in some single conference somewhere. And in this regard, I think that the emerging regional powers, the disruptive powers that Yvonne talked about, can actually play a very important and helpful role.
Hey, Tom, thanks very much. Sergio, please, to pick up on any of the things addressed to you or otherwise.
Yeah. I think I am in a difficult situation because when I'm talking about Brazil, am I talking about this government or am I talking about what Brazil can be if the domestic situation is overcome? I really think I'm convinced about the potential of Brazil playing a larger role in the world scene in a period of transition when the opportunities are very big. But I don't think Brazil is able to play this role now because we are giving up what might be our main assets. And I could give you an example. I see Isabella here, and we have been discussing that. One area is the environment, which was an asset for Brazil, and it became a liability. So we cannot dissociate what is domestic policy from foreign policy. And our domestic policy is jeopardizing our possibilities and our goals in the international scene. And this, I think, also for Latin America, because Brazil has always played a moderating role in Latin America. And now it is playing a divisive role. And I think that when I mentioned the idea of a rapprochement, going closer together between Mercosur and the Alliance for the Pacific, this is not something which is indispensable for us. And I agree with Tom Shannon in this respect, that our regional goals and our world goals can work together. I agree with that, but at this moment, this doesn't work like that. So I think that the potential for Brazil to play a role as it used to do in the past, for instance, in the trade negotiations, in the climate negotiations, is now being jeopardized by domestic policy. I like very much the idea of collaboration should prevail, or the idea of a systemic competition. But in real situations, this kind of collaboration, systemic competition has not worked. When you think, for instance, the relationship between the United States and Europe, of course, they converge now, but not on specific subjects. And to what extent will it be able, will the United States be able to enforce a foreign policy based on values when there are many pressing interests which do not necessarily go along with such values? So I think it's very difficult to think now on a formal design or configuration of world politics, because the real facts, the real localized conflicts or differences in some cases may prevail, and they will make it more difficult for countries to work on a collaborative environment or global environment.
Yvonne.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have this
on this question about, especially about the role of ideology in the Chinese behavior.
That's a great question, and I'm sure that there are people on this seminar who know much more than me about China. But one of the interesting stories about China is, and I'll start with something very simple, but America and China in a certain way know the world in a very different way. America basically knows the world because for centuries, people from different parts of the world were going to America and they have been down and become Americans. And China know the world much more through the Chinatowns. And the interesting story is both of them, of course, a great hegemonic power, but China tries to pretend that this is not a transformative power. America is not simply a universalist power, but transformative power. And from this point of view, I very much agree with the Ambassador Shannon that America, and this is a famous quote, ideologies never worked well in the United States because American being an American is an ideology itself. So from this point of view, America does not have an easiness to be simply transactional because there is a certain view of the world that is part of the American ideology. It's about the idea of freedom, freedom of the individual and others, and the very idea of democracy in the way it is used. I'm saying this because for China, they have the ideology for their own, and of course the Chinese Communist Party is critically important, and communist ideology in the way basically the power is justified. But China believed that they have the advantage of being perceived as non-transformative. So they can come to a country and say, listen, I'm not interested to create a Chinese Communist Party in Bulgaria. Just do what we want and we're fine. So this is a push for asymmetrical relationships without basically the push for transformation, which was part of the Soviet package. From this point of view, Soviet Union was very much like the United States. Where I do believe that China is also lying to themselves that they are not transformative power is that by telling others that you do not have the right to criticize China or transform China, China is an ideological power. For example, when Chinese government is telling that they're going to stop, for example, Chinese tourists groups to go to Heidelberg because there is, I don't know, Dalai Lama monument there, they're already putting a pressure on the German society and trying to transform them. So from this point of view, I do believe that China is going to evolve much more into ideological power the more it competes with the United States. And this is not simply the Chinese Communist Party, and this is not the spread of communist ideology. I do believe that the Chinese have been very much burnt by Mao's experience of the 1970s, when he tried basically to export ideology even more than the Soviets. But by the very kind of positioning themselves as the alternative superpower to the United States, they're going to be more and more perceived in ideological terms, even if when they come to different parts of the world, they don't see it necessarily through a kind of a classical ideological lenses. And I'm saying this because, in my view, also on the level of the cooperation, it's quite interesting, because we believe that it is easier to cooperate with China and others on the climate change because there is a kind of a common problem. But I'll not be surprised if basically climate change is going to end up as one of the most divisive issues. Because certain climate policies, for example, the carbon tax that the European Union is very much interested to put in order to promote climate policies, can end up to be one of the most divisive things with the rest of the world that the European Union has ever been doing. So from this point of view, it's very difficult to distinguish between systemic competition in areas in which you can work. You can, of course, work and you can cooperate on solving crises and you can do this and that. And also what is interesting, and this is my last point, and what I find the situation risky very much because of it, the relations between the states goes also how they perceive themselves, but how they perceive others. I don't know so much about the Chinese, but the Russians are working with a very strong kind of a view that the United States is a declining power, that they cannot keep their hegemonic position, that the European Union is a declining power. And you're going to be shocked to see the power of a small symbolic things. For example, Americans withdraw from Afghanistan, how it works on the Russian kind of a worldview, because they remember that this happened to them before. This is the beginning of the end. These kind of perceptions can push middle powers to take a much more risk policies which are slightly divorced from reality. And this is why I'm very much afraid that this idea of who is in decline, who is on rise, what it means these days to be in decline or rise in a much more interconnected world is creating this highly risky situation. But for the moment, my feeling is that China does not perceive themselves as the ideological power outside of the borders of China, but they're more and more going to be viewed like this, and the competition with the United States is going more and more make out of China a superpower that starts to resemble the Soviet Union.
Vaughn, thanks very much. Let's go back to our group, and we've got a couple of more comments, questions. Nicolo, maybe I turn to you first, please. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thanks a lot. I'm Nicolo Russo Perez. I'm calling from Italy. I'm based with the Compagnia di San Paolo Foundation in Torino, unfortunately not in Sao Paulo, do Brazil, as I would like to be. Two brief questions or comments to the panel, both questions inspired by the interesting framework presented by my friend Ivan Krastev, and nice to see you, Ivan. The first concerns this idea of dictatorship of comparison. It is true, I mean, at least from a European point of view, Italian point of view, we started having people on the street debating data on COVID, debating, comparing data on COVID, debating science at some point. So do you think this is a way that is bringing us towards a more, let's say, science-based policy making? I mean, people came, at least in this country, to a period of skepticism towards expertise and technocratic government. While once we had to confront a challenge like COVID, people were much more eager to listen to, physicians on TV presenting data, trying to explain what's going on, what was happening. So, do you think this is a positive outcome? Where is it bringing? Is it bringing us? So this is the first question, and the second concerning again this idea of increasing role for middle power. It leads to fragmentation, of course. It might lead to a system where we have non-allied states leading the international system. Where does the EU fits in this design? I mean, is the EU a middle power, or what do you think? Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me.
Nicolo, great to have you with us. I have a couple of other people here trying to come in. Patrick, maybe we go to you next, and then Magnus, I see you as well. Patrick Duddy, please.
Good morning. This has been a fascinating discussion. I'm another retired diplomat, and I'm calling in from Duke University. The question that, or an observation on our conversation this morning, virtually no one has mentioned most of the major international organizations. And I'm wondering what any of our three featured panelists think the role going forward for international organizations like the United Nations, but also in the Americas like the OAS is, given that in the aftermath of the pandemic, to take a term from Sergio Amaral, there appears to be a real crisis of confidence in the capacity of systems around the region to address the most urgent needs of their citizens. And as a consequence, there is a real churn in many places in the Americas. And I don't see any international organization, at present at least, playing a significant role. And clearly this crisis of governance is undermining several of the democracies in the region. So I'll just leave it there and ask if anyone sees a role for the UN, maybe with one footnote, and that is that it has always been my sense, certainly it was my sense as a serving diplomat, that many of what Ivan has characterized as the middle powers have always hoped, at least, that the United Nations and other international organizations would be vehicles for great power cooperation. I'm not sure that they ever succeeded, at least not regularly, in serving that function. But I would be curious to know if any of you think that that's a possibility for the future.
Thanks very much, Patrick. And Magnus, over to you.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm Magnus Schultz. I'm also a recycled diplomat. I work now with the Wallenberg office as an advisor, and I'll try to bring in some business and economic and trade dimensions to the discussion, which I found fantastic. And I'm very happy to be able to connect with Ian and Sergio Fausto again. And you have managed this to put this meeting together without any support from me, which I'm of course grateful for. But we are happy to continue a collaboration with GMF and Cardoso Foundation going forward. So, but my point would, I think I would take off somewhere with where Thomas, European Thomas, I would say, Kleine Brockhoff, ended. But of course, just a backdrop on the traumatic experience of the Trump administration for us Europeans. I think in terms of losing our best friend and having the floor disappearing underneath us was of course an experience that we are still working on. That, and together with the pandemic, has given rise to this call for strategic autonomy, which is, I would like Thomas Kleine Brockhoff would vividly argue against. And we think it's just, to be a little bit blunt, a French translation of how they look upon their defense industry into all matters related to European affairs. And we are not comfortable with it from, definitely not from a business perspective, but nevertheless, I think, and of course we have now Biden back in the game, and I think that, of course, it's value-driven as we see Biden, but there's also still, which is similar to the Trump ambition, security-driven, and of course, both those items you would find the Europeans on the same side as the Americans. But I think one feature of Europe, and given the fact that we, of course, want to continue to build our prosperity, and that is based on competitiveness in business terms, and we do struggle with our single market being very imperfect, and the fact, the good tradition, I would say, that we are hugely export-oriented, and Germany and Sweden, case in point. We will be in a we will be the ham in the sandwich if there is too much emphasis on, I would argue, both the values side, even if we support that, but also the security side of things. I can give you an example where, which is widely known and reported, and since we are associated with that company, I can mention it, and it's Ericsson, of course, which is, I would say, a strategic asset on European soil in terms that it together with Nokia, carries a technology that not even the Americans would not be able to put together for the time being. And of course, but again, that company is hugely dependent on China as a market, and how and now under pressure because of the security-related legislation, first as directives from Brussels and then eventually as the Swedish law, overinterpreted by Swedish agencies, now putting Ericsson on the spot, actually, in how it should define its future as a company, because it's starting to lose market shares in China. Should it then jump the ship and be an American entity, or should it manage to be as something that is working its way in the middle, despite the fact that it has this, it is the core of the future infrastructure. That's what it provides, and therefore, of course, involved in the security dimension. So that's a very practical example of where we sit today, and I'm happy to listen to both all panelists on how what would be your advice out of this situation. We have, of course, as industries, good relationships with our American colleagues and in the BR, the Business Roundtable and so forth. And of course, when we speak to them, with a huge majority of those, they think along the very same lines as European industries, but that has little visible effect on the approach of the US at times, because again, values and security would be paramount in anything. And on to our Brazilian friends, I'm a little bit curious also, of course, how they manage this ham situation that we are, but also curious to hear your BRICS experience. I'm not naive. One should not interpret the importance of BRICS, but there you go in a format. Speaking about the international organization, even though it's rather informal, there you have China, especially, of course, also Russia, and you discuss matters with them. I'm curious to hear the Brazilian experience of that exercise. So, well, a bit too lengthy, but I just wanted to introduce the competitive and trade dimension of the situation we're facing. So thank you for your attention.
Well, Magnus, thank you very much. And really very important to have that on our agenda at the end, the economic dimension, the commercial dimension. And so I'm conscious of our time, and you've been all, very patient to stick with us. It's been a great conversation. I want to come back to our three speakers to pick up on what you've heard in the final parts of this conversation, questions to you, other things you may want to add, and this really will be our last round. And, there are a lot of different things, but just to remind in very telegraphic fashion, this question of sort of decline of science and truth decay, is the EU a middle power? What about international organizations, including the UN? And then very importantly, in the end, this question of, sort of the commercial and economic dimension of this strategic sandwich problem. There are a lot of different actors caught in the middle of this sandwich. Maybe the proper analogy is a club sandwich or something like that. But those are important issues for us. So back to our speakers, maybe if we could do it in the reverse order. So I guess that means we go first to you, Sergio, if you would.
Yes. I think many very important issues were raised, and I will quickly mention some of them. I fully agree with the idea that China will be more and more ideological. And I think what the final result of that should be a kind of a mix between the transactional interests and the perception that if they want to become an accepted world power, they will need to insert values and resort to ideology. And this is clear with respect to these meetings of the Belt and Road Initiative, which gathered an important number of countries. And their effort to show, you see, after all this crisis, the pandemic, the economic crisis, our model is perhaps the best one. And this is a recurrent subject in the relations with some developing countries. There's one missing point, I think, in this very important list of issues we have discussed. And from our point of view, I don't know whether we are traumatized, but the issue of populism is of growing relevance for the new world order, because populism in many cases is a source of risk and a source of disruption. And if we think about Mercosur, I agree with Sergio that Mercosur has some problems of their own and they need to be repaired. But what is happening now is an ideological dispute or a political dispute between two populist leaders, and this discussion has lost the sense of a reality and of what we were wrong in dealing with Mercosur. Mercosur needs to be reformed, but the approach which prevails now is a populist approach. I think international organizations deserve a discussion of their own, and I think that they have proved to be unable to help Latin America. But I think the direction we are going to is not the end of internationalization of multilateral institutions. It's a multilateralism a la carte. When multilateral institutions may be useful for some political interests, we resort to multilateralism. When it's not used, let's take it on our own in a small group on a bilateral way. And I don't think, again, that we can talk about resurgence of multilateralism or rebirth of democracy. We are going to go, I think, to something different, and something different which is not the Pax Americana of our previous century, a United Nations family and system, which was conceived in a very rational way, and I think it played its role. We are going to something which will reflect much more the segmentation of our world than a unified vision, which the United Nations was. BRICS is a question mark, and it's a question mark for me too, because the reason for the creation of BRICS does no longer exist, because BRICS was supposed to be a club of medium-sized countries which wanted to work together to play a larger role in the international system. And this was basically a political initiative. And it doesn't make sense now to have together South Africa and China. What is the common interest in the area, in the political arena, in the world political arena? I think it does not exist. So BRICS is moving towards a club for economic cooperation, which may be useful to bring business from these 5 countries to do business together or to promote some interest. But now, at the present moment, I think that the BRICS has more differences than convergences. And I don't think that it can be useful or it can be efficient if we cannot find a common political interest in the group. I think this were the comments I'd like to make with respect to a very, very useful discussion.
Sergio, thank you very much. Yvonne, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be also very brief on science and trust in expertise. And of course, when the COVID started, there was these expectations. I have it also too, that it's easier to trust your doctor than to trust your banker. So if the global financial crisis ended with a kind of a major crisis of expertise, there was a kind of an expectation that we're doing better. But on the basis of the European data that I know, this is like in the old Swiss joke. It's different from canton to canton. There are 2 things that make it problematic. One is, while the science delivered, in a certain way, we had a vaccine in such a short period of time and many things have been done. The very fact that scientists disagree between each other, which is the essence of science, makes it difficult for people to trust science as science. So as a result of it, there is particularly in ideologically polarized countries, people are going to say, no, it is not the experts that inform the government, simply the governments are picking up the experts that go their line. So from this point of view, Poland is a classical example, where the trust in the doctors totally correlates with the trust in the government. You trust the doctors to the extent that you trust the government. And then we go to the important story about EU and what kind of middle power it is. Listen, European Union always wanted to be on a high table. So we didn't want to be a middle power. We have been to be at least middle plus power. And at the same time, there is no other player that lost as much as the result of the crisis of the liberal order than European Union. Of course, it was an American order, but Europe benefited even more than the United States, and for obvious reasons. So as a result of it, for example, Europe has a very clear idea in the world of technology what we want to do. We don't have Alibaba, we don't have Google, and so on, but we're going to regulate. And we're going to be the regulator in chief exactly because we do not have all these multinationals. Listen, if the world go bipolar, whom we're going to regulate? The American technological sphere or the Chinese technological sphere? And from this point for the European Union, this is a really difficult moment because we so much believed in the rule-based order, but always the assumption was that we are going to be part of those who make the rules. How the rules-based order is going to be if the Chinese are going to make the rules in certain areas. So as a result of it, I understand why people basically are uneasy about European sovereignty. I don't know what it exactly means, to be honest, because when you talk to different people, basically sovereignty has this beautiful quality to be so ambiguous that everybody can find the meaning that he or she agrees with. But my feeling is that Europeans understand that the world that comes is not going to be simply the repetition of the Cold War world. They're going to be certain alliance with the United States, but this is not going to be the Cold War type of alliance. And one of the major reasons for this is that the threat that Europeans feel from China is very different than the one that they felt from the United States, from the Soviet Union. Totally different. So this should be something different. And Europe is going to struggle to find a place. And European Union is very big on certain areas. And I do believe that from certain point of view, the climate policy of the European Union is exactly to try to define itself not as a small middle power, for example, like Turkey or Russia, but something as a power of the future that nevertheless cannot share the capacity of the superpowers like the United States and China. Still, it is going to play a very important role. And as a result of it, I also want to end with the idea of the multilateral organizations and so on. My feeling is that the future is very much for the ad hoc multilateralism. This is not going to be so much doing it in the organizations, but created these ad hoc coalitions for trying to solve the problems in which you are trying to find the like-minded powers in order to achieve something like this. I don't know how good news this is, because kind of all these type of ad hoc coalitions have a very mixed results, but probably this is what everybody does in a moment in which time pressure is something that has changed a lot. And from my point of view, this is also what makes democracies kind of struggling so much at the moment. People expect everything to happen immediately in the way it happens in their social media, in the way it happens in their customers' experience. And from this point of view, anything that asks for much longer time to be solved kind of is losing support. And I find this is a strategically big issue, but probably is going to be resolved in a nice way after 2 or 3 seminars like yours. Thank you.
Yvonne, thank you very much. You're setting us a level of ambition that I think we're going to have trouble achieving globally anyway. But Tom,
listen, then you're in the EU game.
Indeed. we wish all of the trilateral partners well in this one. Tom, please, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I also will be brief. In regard to multilateralism, I agree with Sergio Amaral and with Yvonne. I think we're in a period of if not a la carte multilateralism, certainly a form of ad hoc multilateralism. The existing multilateral frameworks will be important because you can do some of the ad hoc and a la carte multilateralism within these structures, but they won't dominate the multilateral landscape in the way that they had for so long. And I think this is especially evident in the Americas. What has been striking to me during COVID is the absolute irrelevance of the OAS and the IDB. PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, did play a role that was useful, but when the United States decided to pull its money out of the WHO, that also meant money going to PAHO disappeared. And so the US decision to step away from a multilateral approach really undermined what could have been, I think, a much more coherent and useful multilateral approach to the pandemic in the Americas. And regrettably, I think the inability of the OAS to escape the partisanism and the politicization in Washington and the capture of the Secretariat General by that partisanship, and then the breakage of relations between the Secretary General and the Permanent Council, especially large hunks of the Permanent Council, as in the Caribbean, really marginalized the OAS. And then the US decision to put an American at the head of IDB split the region in a really unfortunate way. And I think it's going to be a while before these organizations can rebuild themselves and become meaningful participants. And this means that at least in broadly in the Americas, that multilateralism will be ad hoc and will be a la carte and will be ethereal. In other words, it'll be built around very specific issues for a specific purpose, and then it will come undone, and then it will have to be built again. This is kind of fairly dark view, and I'm sorry for it. But It's going to take a lot of effort to reconstruct, what was, the first real effort at regional political, economic, and social cooperation in the world. In regard to expertise and science, my own country has been going through these battles for quite some time, and they begin with something as simple as Darwinism and understanding of evolution, and real cultural battles fought around science and around expertise and learning. But the reality is that technology cannot be stopped, and that it is driving social change and economic change and ultimately political change in ways that cannot be denied. And I think, as was noted, the ability of global science to produce a vaccine in unprecedented time, several vaccines in unprecedented time, to test those vaccines, to win emergency authorization, and then to begin vaccination programs is indicative of what else can be accomplished should governments decide to put the money, expertise, and effort behind technology and scientific research and development. And increasingly, I think societies are seeing this and assuming that vaccinations can be globalized, are going to be demanding that something similar be done to address other issues, whether they be chronic health issues or other issues that affect quality of life in a significant way. In other words, it's going to require societies will be making even more demands of their governments, both national governments and multinational. And then I was very thankful for Magnus's comments at the end, because the reality of trade, the reality of commerce and investment and economic activity is ultimately kind of what defines the impact of how countries relate to each other, how societies relate to each other, how markets and economies relate to each other. And I think it's something we're going to need to keep in mind, because if states attempt to capture economies and markets and use them only for political purposes and begin to tear down the open trading structures that the world has built so painstakingly over time, we're going to see a real decline in quality of life. We're going to see a real decline in the ability of people to get what they're accustomed to getting. It's my hope that this will generate enough of a political backlash that elected leaders and unelected leaders will understand that keeping open trading systems, trying to avoid decoupling, trying to avoid securitizing every aspect of economic and technological activity this all has to be avoided, and that we really need right now to be focusing on preserving what we have in our global trading system, and trying, even if we can't do significant advances in the short term, at least ensuring that we have an openness that we've built over time and that we can maintain.
Tom, thank you very much. And thanks for those important words at the end, which I thought were not pessimistic at all in a way, but to be tested. Tom, Yvonne, Sergio, thank you very, very much. I mean, this has been the second day of an extraordinary 2 days of conversation around, for turbulent democracies, but also in a very turbulent world, as I think we all will agree. This has been a tremendous collaboration. And I just, Sergio, before I give it back to you for a last word, Sergio Fausto, just to thank you and your team and the foundation again for this collaboration. It's great to do this. I hope we're able to do it in Brazil, or if you prefer, in Brussels or elsewhere the next time. I prefer Brazil myself, but there it is. It's really a terrific group that has joined us and spent a lot of time with us, and we're really, really grateful for that and for all the comments. And finally, let me just thank my colleagues, Bill McElhenney, for his advice, but also my colleague Alberto Tagliapietra, who really pulled all of this together on our side. We're very grateful for that. So, Sergio, with thanks, back to you for a last word.
Wow, Ian, it's been great. It's been a pleasure as always. It's a deal. We're gonna organize the next one, hopefully in person in Brazil next year. All of us vaccinated with boosters or not, but it will be really a pleasure to bring all these people together. One of the most interesting and lively webinars I have participated in recent times. I wouldn't dare to summarize it. Each one of us will have his or her main takeaways. My main takeaway is a sort of note of concern that how far is the average political conversation in Brazil in relation to the kind of issues that we have discussed here, right? There is a huge, let me put it that way, cognitive deficit or understanding deficit of what are the dynamics at the global stage and how they might affect Brazil. And that is a point of real concern to me. And one of the objectives of the Cardoso Foundation is, to the extent of our possibilities, is to bridge this enormous gap between that kind of sophisticated conversation that takes into account international dynamics and the more provincial and domestic political conversation that we have in Brazil. So thank you so much for each one of you, especially the three wonderful speakers, and for my special thanks to you and your team at the GMF. Ian, back to you.
Well, I'm just going to wish everyone well and look forward to seeing you all healthy and with us the next time we meet. So good afternoon from Brussels.
Stay safe.
Bye.